So I've already made some videos addressing popular sword myths in movies and video games, and of course one of the most popular video games that involves sword fighting is Dark Souls. So finally I'm going to talk about that. Dark Souls is known as one of the few games that actually have realistic combat mechanics. And I say that because the moves that you see in the game are actually physically possible for a change. They don't involve some ridiculously high jumping or super quick choppy movements or swinging ridiculously oversized 15-kilogram hunks of steel around as if they were chopsticks, things of that nature. Although there are some ridiculously oversized weapons in Dark Souls as well. But generally, if you look at the weapons, the ones that are clearly inspired by historical swords, they are actually pretty well designed. Quite often in video games you see these super thick blades and just too wide and too large in general, but these here are very, very realistic. That's how a usable sword would look. They're not too thick, they don't look too heavy, the grip is the right size, things of that nature. They could be used properly. Although there are also some disgraceful examples of the exact opposite. Also, it's very neat that you can actually switch between one-handed and two-handed usage. In some cases, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do that, but it's quite nice that you have the option. And also what I really like is that you have that mechanic where if your character doesn't have the required strength to wield a sword or any kind of weapon effectively, they will struggle a lot. And this is exactly what it would look like if you were to try to wield an overly heavy sword. By the way, strength alone doesn't really compensate for that. The thing is, a lot of people think that, if you're just strong enough, you can do that. If you're strong enough, you can wield a Buster Sword or whatever. But what they tend to overlook is that in a real fight, speed is paramount. Speed beats strength. If you can hit your opponent before they connect, you win. Basically, it's as simple as that. So if you imagine somebody who is strong enough to use a 10 kilo or 20 kilo sword, imagine what they could do with a historically accurately weighted sword. In other words, in terms of with long sword, about 1.2 to 1.8 kilos. That would be a lot more effective because that person would be much faster and much more efficient. So these are the good things about Dark Souls. Most of the weapons are pretty realistic, the movements overall are physically possible with a couple of odd exceptions, but overall definitely plausible. But one issue is that you shouldn't take it as a reflection of historical sword fighting. Because the thing is, if I look at the character based on my experience with historical European martial arts, that character doesn't seem to be very proficient with swords. The way they use it, it really looks like a novice. And I'm not an expert or let alone master myself, but I can clearly see that this is a case of someone not having been taught formal techniques. Why do I say that? Because the character telegraphs their attacks. What that means is they lift them up too much. They cock their arms too far back before swinging. So what that does is it gives the opponent time to react. And by the way, in terms of gameplay mechanics, that is perfectly fine. Keep that in mind. This applies to the entire video here. The point of this video is to explain what is realistic about the techniques that you see in Dark Souls and whatnot. And while it's realistic, you shouldn't think that this really represents historical sword fighting. This is the main point. In terms of gameplay, this makes perfect sense. This is not a criticism of the game design, because you need that. If the characters actually used appropriate techniques and were very proficient with the swords, you wouldn't have an opportunity to parry, because through the controls it just takes you a bit longer than it does to react with your physical body. So they have to do that, otherwise the game is already pretty damn hard. If they did that, it would be outright unfair. So in terms of gameplay, perfectly fine, no problem. But in a real fight against an experienced opponent, this would get you killed because they know what you're going to do the moment you cock your arms back too far. And also another problem is the character overswings. As you see there, they don't stop the sword in a guard position. They just put too much force into it, then they can't really stop the sword well, and it kind of throws them a bit off balance, and it leaves them very vulnerable. If their opponent merely takes a step back to evade the attack and then attacks them while they are trying to recover from the swing, they are very exposed. So that's the kind of thing that would have gotten you killed in a real historical duel or on a battlefield. One thing that you also see with the spear in particular, overall the thrusts look fine, but the problem is the character stays out there for too long. And that's exactly what you do not want to happen as a spear fighter. If you have a spear, you have a reach advantage, and you want to keep that. And what your opponent, especially if they don't have a spear, what they have to do is close in. They have to get past the point to close in to attack you. So what they want to do is block your spear and grab it. So if you leave it just poking out there, it's too easy for your opponent to actually grab it. So instead, the character should retract the spear as quickly as they thrust it out to not be as vulnerable to counters. To demonstrate, what do you think is more effective? Doing this overswing right there, or simply doing something like this? And that's the general idea here. You don't want to give your opponent time to see what you're up to. You want to attack as quick and as straightforward as you can. Otherwise, your opponent will simply have an easy time to interrupt your attack with an attack of their own. They can close your line of attack with their own sword and counterattack, and then you're done for. It's interesting that the same game includes both very plausible and effective techniques like this right here. That's how it's done. You cover yourself with the shield while attacking. They don't do that with all weapons, oddly enough. And then there is silly nonsense like this. I really don't get it. So there you go. That's what I think about Dark Souls in terms of realism. Again, like I said, in terms of gameplay design, it's perfectly fine, no problem. And the movements for the most part are perfectly realistic. It just doesn't look like a very skilled or experienced sword fighter.